What's up everybody? I have been super ill this week, so I don't really feel like making a guitar video, so I'm going to answer one of you guys' questions instead. And Mr. Anonymous says, "Hi Pete, I recently got into home recording and I've had a tough time with it, especially distorted guitars. Do you think you'd be able to make a video about your recording process, mixing, mastering, etc, etc? Yes! I'm going to show you how I mixed my last song, the one in the, my last riff in the EMG video I did. So let's get to it, let's dive in. So this is what my projects look like when I open them up. I have a project template which is very similar to this. This one's been tailored a bit because obviously I've recorded into it, but when I open these up they usually have Superior drummer, two rhythm guitar tracks, a solo track, two bass guitar tracks, we'll get into what that means later, and the drums are rounded out to individual tracks. So you have a kick, snare, toms, etc, etc. There's a reverb channel for the snare, again we'll get into that in a bit, and then we have buses for everything down here. Okay, so one other thing I want to mention is something I've been experimenting with called top-down mixing, and I grabbed this straight from Nolly from Periphery in his recent Creative Live class, and he basically puts a rudimentary mastering chain on his master out to simulate what it would be like, what the song would sound like, or what his mix would sound like as it goes through the mastering chain later. Now, he would then disable that mastering chain and then just, you know, do it all in the mastering, which is where it should be done. So he'd put everything on there to preview what it kind of sounds like and then take it off later. The exception to that would be EQ, where he would keep an EQ kind of curve, and this is what he did. He did a kind of, he A-B'd stuff to a standard mix that was, you know, a modern metal mix that you'd hear on the, I was going to say on the radio, but they don't exist anymore, but you'd hear online somewhere. And some of my mixes have sounded quite dark in the past, so I've started doing this just to experiment with stuff. Let's hear what it sounds like with and without it. So to me that kind of brings the mix to life, and I really like what that's doing. So I've been experimenting with that kind of thing. You don't have to do that kind of stuff. And obviously I'm not running any kind of mastering plugins like a limiter or like some kind of tube saturation, anything like that, stereo kind of widening kind of things like that. I'm not doing that kind of stuff, I'm just doing the EQ because that's all I want really. I'll do all that mastering stuff in the mastering section. And while I'm talking about mastering, I do all my mastering on Positive Grid's iPad app called Final Touch. I don't have my iPad to hand right now, otherwise I'd show you, but that's what I do it all on. And so yeah. So I guess let's start with the drums, because that's usually where I start. This is Superior Drummer 2.0, of course. And I'm using the Metal Foundry expansion pack, which is, in my opinion, much better than the Avatar kit that comes with Superior. So this is very simple setup. It's just one kick, Thomas Hack snare, 7x14. 4 toms, not generally happy with the toms at the minute, but I might change them out. Can always do that. I have a China, trash, one splash, hats over on the left, and yeah, just some crashes in the ride. So taking a look at the mixer, I want to keep this as brief as possible, but everything is basically taken down into, every instrument track is taken into a bus within Superior, then from that bus in Superior, it's routed out to Cubase. So we see here, I have my kick here, this track, and it's routed to the kick bus within Superior, here, and then that is routed out to out 1, which has been renamed kick within Cubase. So the first thing you see effects-wise with all of these buses here is I have a filter on them, taking out all the low end, below something like 40 Hertz. All the super sub frequencies, you don't want that kind of stuff creeping into your mix because it will accumulate and it will just ruin it. Next up is usually some EQing. So on the kick drum here I'm getting rid of a ton of mids, boosting a little bit in the low end right there, again more mids and shaping towards the top end. What am I doing on the snare? On the snare I'm, I guess, ducking some of the higher mids there, around 1K. That's probably, if I remember right, to get rid of a resonance kind of ringing on the snare drum, just to tame that a little bit. And this is more what I do generally on any kind of snare drum is I boost around 200, 220, somewhere around there, cut again in the mids around 500, and boost up towards the top end, bring out some of the presence. For the toms, again, mids aren't your friend, get rid of lots of mids. Boost some of the presence, but not too much because it can get really clicky. I should probably say at this point that this is just what I do. I've learned this stuff all by myself. There's kind of guidelines, but there's no real hard rules to this. If you like the way something sounds, go with it. So moving on to compression and things. On the kick drum, these are the settings I'm using. These were just the ones I liked at the time. Usually around 4:1 ratio of compression. And kind of the release, I don't like to keep it too fast. So it's usually around 80 to 100. And the attack is those settings for this one. Just play around with some of the settings until you find something you like. It's a good way of learning what these plugins do as well. If you've never used a compressor before, you won't necessarily know what it's meant to do, what it's meant to sound like. So just play around and you'll get a feel for it, and you'll start to hear the sounds that you want come from these plugins. For the snare, compression ratio of 4:1 or around that. Release is around 100. If you have it too fast, it tends to take away some of the aggressiveness of the snare, I find. And the attack, if you have the attack set too fast, it again gets rid of that aggression that you want. So this is kind of around where I have it. Usually between 20 and 30 is the sweet spot, I think. Let me show you what happens with the attack when I bring it up from really fast to somewhat of a slower attack. I'm going to leave it around there. So again, if you go too fast on some of these things, it tends to take away some of the aggressiveness. So let's quickly look at the rest. Hi-hats basically have no EQ on them whatsoever. So there's really nothing there to show. But on the overheads, I'm kind of just taking out little frequencies I thought were annoying. And on the room mics, kind of a similar thing. You can compress your overheads. Sometimes it's not necessary. This time I have, but over on the room mics, it's generally always a very nice and pleasing sound for metal to really compress the crap out of your room mics. So throughout all of this, I've actually been sending it to a parallel compression track. All of these channels go to this comp track here. So I'll show you what it sounds like here. So from Superior, I'm sending everything to individual tracks into Cubase. I'm routing it to individual tracks in Cubase so I can have full control over the faders and automation and things like that. It's very important. On the kick drum and the snare, I made a few more adjustments to the EQs. So I'm also sending the snare and the toms to a reverb channel. And these are the settings I'm using. This is a plugin called Verbiage, which is free, but it's pretty good. So this is what it sounds like on its own. And this is what it sounds like with the snare and the toms. So I'm going to toggle that in and out now so you can hear what it sounds like in context. I'm going to start without and then I'll put it back in. So you see it adds quite a lot of roominess to the drums and it makes them sound a lot bigger and a lot more impressive. And just finally, to wrap up the drums, I'm doing a bit of compression here. Some similar settings to what we've seen so far. Not quite as much compression, but yeah, slower release and a kind of slowish attack. Okay, so moving on to guitars. So it looks like there's 4 guitars here and I've quad tracked it. I guess I have quad tracked it, but I'm only using 2 guitars at the same time. And that's because these 2 are the 81, this was a pickup demo, so these 2 are the 81, these 2 are the 85 pickup. So I'm only using the 81 guitars at this time. These ones are muted completely. Before we get into the mixing of the guitars, I just want to show you my edits here. These are just crossfades that I've put in. because I record my guitars usually section by section. That's just personal preference, actually. That's just the way I like to do it. Some people like to do the entire performance at once, which is a great time saver, but I'm not a one-take wonder, so sometimes you make a mistake and you have to retrack something, and rather than retrack the whole thing, I prefer to do it section by section. So yeah, these are just crossfades, fairly standard stuff really, just to make all the sections blend. The guitars are actually fed to a bus like everything else. On the actual tracks themselves, there's nothing going on at all. They're panned hard left and hard right, and that's it. And then from there, I'm sending them to this bus. And on this bus, I am using a high pass and a low pass, compressor, and just a little bit of EQ. So let's turn everything off and see what it sounds like. So these are the guitars raw as they came out of the guitar. So the first thing I always do is high pass and low pass, and that's basically to get rid of any of the low frequencies, same kind of thing that we did with the drums. Anything below usually 90 Hz to 100 is kind of unwanted in the guitars, so you just cut it out completely. On the low pass at the top here, it kind of depends what kind of settings are on your amp when you recorded it. I use Jam Up Pro here on a tread plate, which can get quite fizzy. I usually high pass this around 6,000, but sometimes it can be as, you know, around 4,000, even 12,000, something like that. It just depends. Play around with it and you'll see what I mean here. I think around there sounds good. So from there, just a bit of compression. Really, everything here is on a fast attack and fast release, and you're basically trying to clamp down on any palm mutes that might get out of control. I've also turned up the volume a little bit here, make up gain. You can play around with settings on that. Sometimes you can get some cool results by playing around with the attack and release, but you want to avoid it pumping. So from there, just did a little bit more EQ. And usually I like to do, because this was a pickup demo, I didn't do as much EQing as I normally would. I wanted the guitars to sound as they were, really, rather than changing it. That would be a dishonest kind of thing. So I just did a few notches around 2 and 3K. That's usually a good idea, because there are some really annoying frequencies up there. Let me show you. Yeah, really unpleasant. You can hear what I'm talking about. And usually there's a cut around 240-ish, 250-ish, because the guitars can get a little bit muddy down there. Experiment with EQ. You can, you know, try things. The best rule of thumb for guitars, I find, is to get the tone at the source. So the sound coming out of your amp and into the microphone, or the sound coming out of your VST, whatever, get that sounding good, and that's half the job. So let's move on to bass. There's 2 tracks of bass. Again, they're both fed into a bus, but the difference between these and the guitars is that these are exactly the same track, just copied over. So these waveforms are identical. Let's hear what it sounds like. My bass tones, I've never really been happy with a specific bass tone, but they can vary quite wildly depending on the song, whether it's an 8-string song, drop C, 7-string song, in drop A or something like that. It depends on what you're doing. Fresh strings is always a must, really. Okay, so let's take a look at what the bass sounds like with nothing on it. Everything turned off just as it is coming straight into the interface. What you're hearing there is the dry DI signal. There's nothing on it at all. It goes straight from the guitar into the interface. There's no compression, no EQ, other than the one on the bass guitar. Nothing at all. From there, you double the track. This is what I was talking about earlier. We do this because we want control over the low end, which is why this is called bass low, and the high end independently. This is called bass high. So these are exactly the same waveform. There's nothing different at all. In fact, I can copy it again and show you. This is what I did. I recorded it on the bass low track, and I copied it and pasted it right down there. So the next step that I do is I want to shape these a little bit. So I use Easy Mix. for my low track, and it is on Easy Mix 2, sorry I should say, and it is on the Frederick clean bass setting. I just like the way that one sounds. And from there, I introduce a low pass, to cut out all the high pick attack, because this one is for the low end. And usually I bring this way down to somewhere like 500, maybe even maybe 1,000, something like that. But with this one, I liked it up here because I was getting some interesting pick attack from it, which I thought added to the vibe. So on the other track, this is your high track, or it's probably more accurately a distortion track. So this can vary wildly from song to song what you do with your distortion track for the bass. For this one I opted to go more of an overdriven kind of sound rather than a noisy distortion kind of sound. So I used the Tosin Mid preset from Bias Effects, and this is what it sounds like. And from there, another high pass and a low pass. And basically this one's at 400, this one is, again, you can play around with these, but these are the settings I chose for this because I thought it worked in conjunction with the low end better. So the two of them combined sound like this. So from there, I'm feeding them into a bus, like with the guitars and drums. And this is where you do most of your processing. First thing again, high pass and low pass. And this high pass, it's got a really steep incline, curve, slew, I think it's called. And that's to basically keep as much low end as possible, but keep it completely out of the range of the kick drum, which is around 50 to 60 hertz. That's where the real sub frequencies come in for the kick drum, and I want to keep it out of that because if the two interact, it will be a muddy mess and it just won't have any clarity at all. And the low pass on this one is at a very high level. It's like 12,000, 12k, and it's basically just to polish off the real high frequencies to keep them out of the way. On your bass bus, the first thing you do is compression. We're going to be compressing a lot on this. So again, this is fairly standard settings that I've used all the way through this project. Kind of an attack of around 21 or 20, release around 100, and a 4:1 ratio-ish. I just seem to like those settings and they work. This is what it sounds like. Okay, so next up, EQ. And with this I was just boosting some low end because we'd taken some out down here and I just wanted to boost a bit more down here. And I wanted to bring out some of the clanginess. This is a really important one. The next step is multi-band compression. If you've never used a multi-band compressor before, a multi-band compressor compresses only a specific frequency range within the instrument you're working on. So I've bypassed the really low one here in the subs, and I've bypassed a really high one up here. And we're just working on two of them here. Let's see what it sounds like. So that frequency range is where all the meat of the bass is, and we really want to keep that consistent. That's the key to this. We're compressing this because we want to we want to really eliminate any dynamics. Bass is very dynamic when it comes straight into the interface, and we want to eliminate that because it needs to be consistent. Fast attack, actually the fastest attack and fastest release I can do here. Not too high a ratio, and I'm boosting it a little bit. So moving on to the next bit. This is kind of the mid-frequencies, which you don't really want to emphasize too much unless you're trying to blend them with the guitars. So let's see what this one sounds like. So compared to the other one, this one's got some pretty different settings. This is just what worked for me. On some projects, I may not even do this step. I'll just do this one. All of it combined so far. The next step, more EQ. Now this is basically just notching out some frequencies I thought were ugly, and this low one here, is it? Yeah. This low one here is just, again, keeping it completely out of the way of the kick drum. Next step, more EQ. And this was just overall shaping. Again, I'm keeping the kick drum out of the way with a very specific dip in frequencies there. Sometimes when you're compressing things, the sub frequencies can creep back up, I find anyway. So I've cut them again with another high pass. So the last piece in this bass chain is a big old limiter, and that's to bring it up to volume and to compress it some more. Again, we want this to have almost zero dynamics. It needs to be really consistent, and this is what it sounds like. So I'm going to toggle on and off all the stuff we've done on this bass bus so you can hear what it sounds like before and after. So you can hear that's quite a big difference. And that's basically it for the bass. So that's kind of it. I hope that answers your questions. Now, this is just the way that I do things. There's no real rules to this. There's only guidelines. If you've got something else which you feel works and you want to do it, by all means go and do it. There's no rules here. So thanks for watching, and go forth and mix.